aware of the rules. Please respect them. I won't repeat them. Yeah, I'm going to be putting timestamps in the chat. So without further ado, Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Jess, I think you're muted.
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you.
Thank you for telling me. Western liberal democracies have tried to subsidize green tech. They've tried to shift people away from working in fossil fuel firms, but there's so much dependency on fossil fuels that none of these measures are working. The only thing that has managed to constrain big companies, such as Google, is antitrust policies, and that's why they're needed in the field of green tech. We're going to be forwarding two arguments from opening government. Firstly, on why we're far more likely to spur on the innovation of green tech and get far more of it in the world. And secondly, on why, even if this isn't the case, antitrust policies on these large and exploitative companies is a good in and of itself. Before that, 4 points of setup. Number one, what do these green antitrust policies look like? It looks like policies such as preventing M&As, preventing them from buying up supply chains and vertical integration, and imposing market thresholds. For example, the threat to break up a company if it's over 80%. Note that it's likely that these are going to be successful insofar as they're implemented in countries with strong regulation regulatory establishments such as the EU that have had experience in using antitrust policies against huge firms such as Google in recent weeks. Secondly, how do you assess what a green company is? We think it looks like things like the amount of the carbon emitted, the field that they are into, whether or not they're explicitly developing green tech or whether they're doing mining or fossil fuels, and assessments are probably made frequently, assessments are probably updated. Thirdly, note this doesn't mean that there is no antitrust whatsoever when it comes to green tech companies. It's just that the antitrust requirements on non-green tech companies are far, far harsher. And lastly, what do opposition need to defend? The status quo where green tech companies face huge barriers, both in getting established and also once they are established in being able to innovate in the first place. With that in mind, let's get into the first constructive as to why we are likely to spur on the development of green tech. The first question to ask here is why it's incredibly harmful and why fossil fuel companies are able to crowd green tech companies out of the market. There are two things here on capacity and incentive. On capacity, there's two reasons. The first is that fossil fuel companies are able to engage in huge mergers and acquisitions. They have an incentive to do so because there's significant pressure on fossil fuel companies to leave the market under the status quo because of the fact that green tech is something that is perceived as something's becoming more popular. And so what this means is that smaller fossil fuel companies tend to agree to be bought up by bigger fossil fuel companies. What this means is that these fossil fuel companies and those who are resisting the development of green tech and investing in things like mining, such as Glencore, are able to access huge economies of scale. They're able to access vertical integration, meaning that they are able to buy up whole supply chains and access lots of resources. Secondly, they are also able to exert a huge amount of dominance over particular countries as a result of the fact that they have all of this capital and all of these resources. So this looks like engaging in investor-state dispute settlements against smaller countries because of the fact that they have so much political capital and power. Why do they have the incentive to crowd out these green tech companies from the market? Essentially, green tech companies are often in opposition to these companies. They've often launched huge PR campaigns against these companies, threatening their dominance. And because of this direct competition, they have the incentive to engage in these anti-competitive measures. Why is it very hard for green companies alone to compete with these companies? There are a number of reasons for this. The first is that they don't have the same level of established infrastructure. And what this means is that the startup cost is significantly higher when it comes to green tech companies. Secondly, it's often very difficult to establish green tech companies in the first place, and that's because of the fact that you have to buy up patents. Often green tech is a relatively new invention and patents have not yet expired, and so green tech companies find themselves spending hundreds and thousands of pounds on acquiring the rights to specific formulae that they use then in their inventions. Thirdly, the way in which these green tech companies themselves carve out their comparative advantage is by competing with each other, because that's the way in which you are able to gain gain investment and gain funding and gain the confidence of shareholders. What this means is that there is no similar incentive on the part of green tech companies to merge with other green tech companies that exists on the part of fossil fuel companies. And that means that opposition can't make arguments about how it's likely that green tech companies are going to be able to use these powers to merge and to therefore gain market dominance in the way that fossil fuel companies can. Fourthly, it's often the case that these green tech companies are bought up by bigger fossil fuel companies in order to improve their PR. For example, Australian green tech firm Enzo being bought up by mining companies. This dilutes the power of these companies and also their ability to innovate. And lastly, there's far more market share on the part of fossil fuel companies. Shareholders know that they have a more stable source of profit when they're investing in these than they do on green tech companies. Why is this incredibly harmful? Essentially, it means that it's very difficult to get profitable green tech innovation. This is something that is critical. It's powering our future. It's what's stopping the climate from getting warmer. It's what's stopping animals from dying. But secondly, it also means that individuals are just deterred from entering the green tech field in the first place. Because if you're a top scientist, you know that it's far better to go and work for fossil fuel companies that are making established profits. How do we change this on our side? There are broadly three reasons. The first is that carbon-intensive products are likely to get far more expensive on our side. The reason for this is that when you prevent these economies of scale from forming and you prevent these mergers and acquisitions, it's difficult for these mining companies to achieve the economies of scale that they access under the status quo. For that reason, companies are more likely to align themselves with greener firms because of the fact that you get the PR incentives and the benefits of doing that without the cost of this being significantly more expensive, which is the reason why most companies decide not to go for these firms under the status quo. Secondly, and crucially, larger companies also have an incentive to change to become green firms. And so you are able to harness the capital that significant fossil fuel companies such as Glencore have under the status quo and channel it towards the funding of green tech, as opposed to having these new companies setting up and having to innovate from scratch. And thirdly, just in terms of optics, when you make these companies more competitive, there's more scientists who want to come and lead and work in this industry because it's perceived as far better. Before I move on to explain why this is the best measure, I'll take closing.
So if you buy your characterization, which is that these fossil fuel companies are so much more profitable, even if on the margin it becomes a bit more expensive, surely it doesn't skew that much to lead to that much more innovation into green tech.
It's far more likely to lead to innovation into green tech. So if you're a big company, you have an incentive to become one of those green firms because you don't want to be subject to these harsh antitrust regulations because it's politically embarrassing for you when you have to undergo a trial, for example. Why is this the best measure of achieving this? Because note that they can probably say that you have things like subsidies into green tech on their side. There's a couple of things to note. The first is that it's less expensive than pouring in huge amounts of subsidies. The secondly is that it's less politically volatile because subsidies are more able and more likely to vary between administrations, whereas it's very difficult to repeal this antitrust legislation when you have it in place. The last thing I want to note here is on why antitrust is good, even if it's not, even aside from the fact that these green tech, even aside from the fact of green tech innovation. Essentially, there are particular harms of these non-green firms. They engage in oil spills, they extract resources, they harm developing countries. They make supernormal profits and they suppress innovation as a result of that. If we are able to increase antitrust regulations on them, if we're able to at least threaten them with the possibility of getting broken up, they have a preemptive incentive to change these practices and harm them. So even if we don't get more green tech, we get better regulation of these behemoths in the market. For all of these reasons, opening government.
I would like to thank Prime Minister for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Leader of Opposition to start a case for opening opposition. Hear.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Thank you. POI's in the chat. And also before my speech, I don't often do this, but I know this is Eddie's second BP tournament and he made it to semis, and I know he doesn't give enough credit to himself. So just wanted to give him a little shout out before we start. Cool. All right, starting on my next word. I'm going to be honest, and this is with full respect to the CA team. I really think that this is a really dumb idea because many types of energy portfolios in most developed worlds still require coal and energy peaker plants because of the fact that there are natural monopolies that are associated with utility companies that are carbon intensive. When you break up these companies, you greatly increase the rates of energy costs. You increase grid volatility. You increase rates of blackout. And this is ultimately fucking horrible. What do we support on our side? We think think we can get government benefits through 6 other mechanisms rather than breaking up carbon-intensive firms. Firstly, establishing statutes that regulate pricing and rate making of utilities through regulatory forces like FERC or the Federal Energy Regulation Commission, or ERC like the European Energy Regulation Commission, that have been in existence since the 1960s through things like auction prices for energy generation. Secondly, through environmental laws like the Clean Air and the Clean Water Act that you can litigate against these firms. Thirdly, you can use preliminary injunctions through things like litigation against a coal plant or a fossil fuel company if they have not fulfilled prerequisite EIS statements, environmental information statements, which have been used to stall developments of coal plants in places like Wyoming and South Dakota that have made it so that they were more accountable. Fourthly, renewable portfolio standards that require utility companies to allocate a certain percentage of their energy from renewable industries. And if they don't fulfill this by a certain year, these utility companies face litigation. Fifthly, tax credits for renewable energies through things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which they might say might be repealed under Trump or by other right-wing politicians. But since these solar and wind energies are largely in red states, we think this largely applies. Why do we think this is mutually exclusive? I think if you impose all of these things, it requires a great degree of political capital. These things, as in these antitrust policies, these are political capital you can't use to support these other types of alternatives. All right, our first argument today, you're going to increase energy prices and you're going to increase grid volatility within the energy sector. The first thing I want to talk about here is that renewable energy generation has a capacity and storage issue where energies cannot be stored when the sun is not out and when the wind is not blowing, which means that we get most of our energy supply from solar panels in the middle of the day. But the issue is that's not when most people use energy. Most people use energy during 2 moments of peak demand. First is 7 a.m. in the morning. Second is 7 p.m. when people come back at work. Notably, these are places where solar and wind do not apply. So you know what we have to do? You have to use the natural monopolies with the utilities that are carbon intensive through things like coal and gas peaker plants. Coal and gas are necessarily peaker plants because they can basically meet this demand on a quick time basis, whereas other new sources like hydro and nuclear are not quick enough to fall out. This is incredibly important because even on their side of the house, you're still going to rely on coal and gas in order to fund your energy grid of your country. Secondly, why does antitrust hurt the capacity of coal and energy companies to fulfill this requirement? Firstly, they have large economies of scale, which is to say it is okay for them to operate kind of at a loss during these peak demands because they know that the type of leases that they deal with the government are going to outweigh that. They are more willing to operate at a loss during these peak demands because simply in this time frame it gets outweighed. Second, only through economies of scale can you do things like build transmission lines, build substation generation sites that convert AC to DC electricity that you rely on. The important aspect of this is that when you're unable to use this efficiently, you get massive amounts of power outages and blackouts, especially when there's a natural disaster occurrence, heavy wind, heavy rainfall, heavy snowfall. And secondly, you increase the prices of these goods. You increase heating bills, you increase energy prices, you increase gas prices. The second burden I want to prove, just because you're a natural monopoly does not mean you are necessarily evil and bad. The way electricity transmission and energy generation works is that they are natural monopolies. Because firstly, energy is fungible. You don't care if it comes from coal or solar. You want electricity at the end of the day. Secondly, the margins are smaller. That's to say it is highly, highly inefficient to have 60 transmission lines. It's far more cost effective to simply have one. So these are natural monopolies and it's unfair to break up a company on that sole basis. Thirdly, I think prices naturally increase when now you're less able to construct these transmission lines to these solars. The impact of this is quite simple. And I want to make this very, very clear. Utilities are obviously going to be carbon intensive. The reason behind this is because when most developed countries built their grids and their transmission lines, it was at an age in which solar and wind energy did not exist. Therefore, the types of where the transmission lines are going to are not places that are advantageous to solar. This is important because if you're an electricity solar generation plant, you still need this transmission line. But when you break up like utility companies or energy companies, you get less economies of scale to construct this, which means it's a heavier cost on solar companies, utility grade solar companies, who now themselves have to construct things like transmission lines and stuff like that. Their side of the house tried to say this. It is really, really bad for utilities and oil companies to buy up renewable grids. Firstly, it is illegal in most Western liberal democracies for this to happen through things like PURPA, which state that you, as a utility, have to have equal types of like received payments from an like a renewable energy grid and a non-renewable like generation grid and stuff like that. So I'm going to talk a bit about the comparative, why it's a lot better, like without this like antitrust thing. But before that, I'll let CJ have a POI.
Do you think there's wide-scale support for regulation that prevents all corporations in an economy from producing things with fossil fuels?
Bit of a stupid POI. I think, as I mentioned, like natural gas and coal are still going to be existent within the grid. I don't think that this is a bad thing. All right, second argument. Why is the comparative better? Carbon-intensive firms are already turning green. They say it is bad for Exxon to buy a solar company. I really do not know why this is the case. I think it is probably preferable for Exxon to buy a lithium synthesizing factory and develop battery storage for solar plants or anything and sell them to solar companies at like a cheaper price. Secondly, I also think that these companies are turning towards green technology because it's more cost efficient. Like EV engines are more energy efficient than in combustion engines, which makes it so that they are able to be more cheaper to produce and stuff like that. Secondly, I also think that in general, we are electrifying, like changing our grids to become more renewable friendly. Like UK just recently have a phase out plan for their coal for the next 20 to 30 years. And I think that's beneficial. Lastly, you alienate the climate movement from working and middle class people because energy prices increase, blackouts increase. This is what the right wing has used to galvanize their political base. Trump saying, listen, look at the price of your heating bills and see how much they increase. Since voters are subsistence voters, it limits the ability for you to enact more green energy in the future. Very proud to oppose.
I would like to thank Leader of Op for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Deputy Prime Minister to continue with the case for opening government. Hear, hear.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. The two parts of the OO case cannot work together. They first spend a lot of time and a lot of science telling you that you cannot possibly switch to green tech and you're always going to need coal and gas. The second part of the case is that companies are already switching, so why do we need your policy, including their 6 measures? These two things are contradictory. If it was really not possible to switch, why would their measures work and why would companies switch anyways? The reality, and I think you know this, I think this is like average voter information about green tech, right? Is what Jess tells you, which is that yes, companies are already switching to a degree and they have a capacity to do that. What holds them back is that in the short term, things like oil are far more profitable. We need to balance that out. I'm first going to solidify our impact in the debate, why we are better for green tech and weigh that as the most important outcome. Next, I'm going to take the trade-off why it's okay that oil gets more expensive. First, why are we better for green tech? I first want to note that why it is possible for companies to switch to green tech. The reason is like beyond the fact that it's already happening to a degree, is that companies rationally know that in the long term, what is better for them, what is better for profit is going to be green tech because these don't depend on resources that are going to be limited. There are also many other reasons for this, like increasingly liberal populations demanding regulations on oil companies and being more conscious of climate change. That means that it is going to get more expensive for them to produce oil and gas in the future, and they'd rather switch, and green tech is going to be more possible. We also tell you things like the solar panel doesn't work at night, don't work because people, when they innovate, create solutions around this. Like if you look at all the innovations that Chinese companies have done to ensure that you are able to create this sort of renewable energy, which has many other sources besides solar, by the way, we tell you it is possible to have green tech in the future. But crucially, even if it isn't, if our case works to a degree, that is, you reduce your carbon emissions, not to zero, but to less, and replace some of it with green tech, we still see that as a win, given that we're on the tipping point of things like climate change. So it is possible. Why do we say this is going to happen? Just gives you two mechanisms. First, that green tech is comparatively cheap, that we make green tech comparatively cheaper than the alternatives when we raise the cost of oil companies due to preventing them from doing things like mergers and vertical integrations. This solves the problem in status quo, that producing oil is in the short term cheaper than producing green technology. Note that when we limit their integration and market share, we balance that out, and therefore it is no longer cheaper to produce oil instead. But second mechanism, we incentivize companies to invest in green technology. Existing companies want to diversify to where they would have less harsh regulations, and companies want to enter the market to be considered under less harsh regulations under green tech. So why do we need this policy when they can just implement 6 other things? First, we've already been doing this and it hasn't been working. The stumbling block is that green technology is far less profitable. Even when you have preferential investments, governments need to spend a huge amount of money subsidizing them, and therefore governments need to spend a huge amount of money subsidizing them, and therefore it is incredibly hard to outweigh the immense profits that they have from creating oil. Why are these measures not exclusive? We think the political capital we have to do this is incredibly high because currently regulation of big businesses, especially energy companies that cause climate change, is incredibly electorally popular in Western liberal democracies. That's why Veta can say things like even in red states, these things have been implemented. The people who are historically the most defensive of coal mines. So we don't think they're exclusive at all. We just think we need our policy as well. But even if it is exclusive somewhat, and we were to trade this off, we think that's worth it because all these other measures are incredibly costly. That means that they are likely to be repealed when the next government comes in and when this is no longer part of the discourse of the political cycle because they cost the government a huge amount that they could be spending on other things. So we think the political capital here is asymmetric. So even if it is exclusive, we rather do ours because it is more effective and lasts for longer. Okay, why is the extent of change likely to be huge? I think this answers the POI that CEO gave to Jess. First, the main reason why companies don't transition to green tech now is that it is more expensive. By balancing that out, that is when we get the greatest amount of change. But second, the fact that we can couple it with existing investments, like all the things that OO talk about, means that this is likely to be incredibly effective in for the mechanisms that we say. Weighing this point, why is green tech the most important impact that any team is going to bring you? First, this is critical since fossil fuels are running out. This is a way of ensuring the world has energy in the future. Second, green technology firms are also far better for developing countries. Things like not spilling oil in the ocean and destroying resources and hurting people's lives and livelihoods. Third, green tech is far more resistant to global volatility. So for example, the war in Ukraine disrupting oil supplies, green technology is far more resistant to that. So for both developed and developing countries, and for the most vulnerable people who live in places near oil fields, etc., it is the most important impact that we are able to develop green tech. Let's answer the main question of opening opposition. Why is it that we are willing to trade off oil getting more expensive? First, we don't think the costs are going to be passed on to the consumers. If you look at the oil market, prices are controlled very carefully globally due to things like OPEC or the fragile balance between oligopolies. So what we think is more likely the trade-off. We agree that companies are going to bear a greater cost, but we don't think they can increase the price to a significant degree because they will be undercut by consumers. Think about how they could increase the price to an incredible degree now because they control the supply, but they don't because they know that they'll be undercut by other people. We think this is the maximum to which they can increase the price. What is far more likely is that you decrease the profits of the companies. Why is it that we know this is possible? Because oil companies currently make insanely high supernormal profits. So what is more likely is that we just cut down the profits of these oil companies and incentivize them to change. And we think it's incredibly unlikely that any of these costs are going to be passed on to the consumers. But even if we take them at best and be super charitable, we think that regulating these companies is better for people, even if we have to accept slightly higher costs of oil. But before that, CEO, do you have anything?
Yeah, so the problem is if you buy the framing to be true, which is that these companies are super entrenched within society, then surely there's going to be massive resistance, particularly to this policy, as compared to any other policy that don't directly harm the livelihood of these particular companies.
Wait, I don't think it was ever part of framing that these companies are super entrenched within society. I think the average person in Western liberal democracies kind of has a lot of hatred for oil companies. I don't think there's going to be huge resistance. Okay, finally, even if oil prices increase, why are we willing to trade this off? In the last part of our speech, just gives you an argument that even if we don't incentivize green tech, it is good to have harsher antitrust regulations on companies that are massive, often exercise monopoly power to extract resources, monopoly power to exploit workers, and suppress innovation. We tell you that when we regulate these companies harsher, first, it is better for the countries that are exploited because there's less control over their resources by massive companies who control a massive majority of the market share. By preventing them from merging with other bigger companies in developed countries, it means that they have to compete over resources in developing countries and therefore can extract these resources less. Second, smaller companies are less able to be acquired. So when the big company only is allowed to have 30% instead of 45% of the market, they can acquire less smaller companies, which means that you get more innovation on our side of the house. So even if you try to take them at their best, that oil and gas innovation is good, you get more of that on our side when smaller companies aren't suppressed. So it is worth taking the trade-off to regulate these really big, really evil companies. And even if you don't believe that, we win on green tech, the biggest impact. OG.
I would like to thank Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue with the case for opening opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yes to both.
Okay, cool. Mm, 30 seconds. Okay, I prefer verbal POIs. And I'll start on my first word. Let me first make one very important distinction. Oil is used for cars. Gas and coal are used for electricity. And gas and coal are not controlled by OPEC. The reason why this distinction is important is because OO's only response to Victor's analysis as to why like prices are likely to increase on side opening government, or why they're likely to decrease on our side to healthier levels, is by saying, oh, there's cartelization, like the benefits don't trickle down to the consumers. This cartelization only applies to the one industry, to the one industry that doesn't really apply to our analysis, meaning that a lot of what Victor says still applies. Like ultimately the harms and the benefits are passed on to the consumers on either side of the house. But the next thing he tries to tell us is that our case is contradictory. No, it is not contradictory. This is called nuance. What we told you was that firstly, a lot of the times what gas and coal like companies need to function is a form of economies of scale. The reason for this is because the kinds of plans, the kind of infrastructure that they run are incredibly massive, like massive to maintain, really marginal in terms of profits, and they take up a natural monopoly in the space in which they operate. That is why they are big in the first place. It is not because of some like malicious, it is not because of some like sort of malicious growth. The second thing we told you was that these green tech companies, as OG also like identifies, is that they recognize that in the long term, they have to switch over eventually. That is to say, a transition is possible, but if and when it occurs, it will not be a complete transition. This is what like gas and coal companies recognize. It cannot be a complete transition. It's only to be supplemented at certain times using peak factories or whatever at certain points in time. That is why the transition cannot be like fully complete. That is why. So that's the reconciliation of the contradiction. But why is this balance only able and transition only struck on our side of the house? 3 reasons. Firstly, there's already an existing ecosystem of regulations and alternatives that Victor gave you and that they never were able to respond to. These alternatives exist in the status quo, and we think are quite sufficient in making sure that the like ultimate power of these companies is capped at a maximum level. Why is this? Firstly, he gave you like things like statutes that regulate energy price making, things like litigation against them if they violate specific obligations towards environmental obligations, things like tax credits, which already exist in the status quo. But secondly, what OG needed to do was prove that these existing obligations are insufficient at tampering their power. Secondly, there are existing ways for green tech to be competitive, and this is really important. Right now, there are carbon taxes, and there are some countries that don't have carbon taxes. Obviously, this is a problem because it means that like goods that were produced with carbon taxes are likely to be more expensive, the exact problem that OG describes. The way that countries in today's world have identified and dealt with this problem is through climate tax barriers. That's just to say, if you're exporting a good which is made artificially more expensive because of your climate tax, your carbon tax policies, and it has to compete in the international market against goods that were produced through carbon-intensive methods, what you do is you impose a barrier, that is to say, these goods get taxed to an equivalent degree, meaning that the competitiveness of these goods is already guaranteed on the international stage. So a lot of the harms that OG is worried about are already mitigated. The EU does this for steel. The EU does this for steel, for instance, which is why UK exports of steel into the EU were so much more expensive then. Thirdly, the mechanism that Victor gave to you, which is really crucial in the long term, is that you brand the climate movement as the opponent of the middle class. This is important because voters are subsistence voters. Voters care about their own oil and gas prices because this is what determines whether they're able to pay their bills, whether they have to choose between food and heating.
Right.
What this means is that if you increase the price of this in the status quo, and voters recognize that the climate movement is the reason for why these antitrust measures were put into place in the first place, then you diametrically oppose them to the climate movement. It means that when a later green transition comes, they're far more likely to be reticent and reluctant to move over. They're far more likely to oppose it in the long term. Secondly, I think that what is important for us to prove is why these green antitrust measures are likely to seriously damage the capacity of carbon-intensive firms to maintain things like grid stability, but as well as to do things like conduct R&D. What is the reason for this? And here, I want to be clear on the extent of damage. In order for OG to get their benefits, which are quite massive in terms of you have to significantly shrink the market threshold of these companies. They have to do this to a pretty large degree in order to meaningfully increase the competitiveness of green tech. And they give us the reason why. They say that the disparity between the two is really large in the status quo, which means that any penalties they need to impose need to be really large. The reason why this is bad is because, as already described to you, there's a precarious balance. That is to say that these companies being so large is the only reason they're able to provide you gas and oil at the correct prices in the status quo. So in many cases, for instance, you are literally having the size of the company because you feel that it exceeds this higher threshold that you're then imposing on the carbon intensive sources. What this means then is that these companies are pretty massively being penalized, and their ability to do things is massively slashed. Before I move on into another argument, give your POI closing.
Why does antitrust involve breaking up companies rather than just preventing future mergers?
It involves both, and we told you that it involves both, and we told you that many of these energy companies are already natural monopolies in the status quo, which means they're artificially and disproportionately more likely to be subjected to antitrust laws because they exist as a natural monopoly, but a lot of times regulations don't recognize that and still artificially penalize them. Okay, moving on to an argument then. Why does this reduce the capacity of these fossil fuel companies to invest into green transition? Presently, and I think OG already agrees with a lot of this, a lot of the largest oil and gas companies are funneling billions of dollars into private green energy research. So BP, for instance, is building offshore wind farms. ExxonMobil is investing into retrofitting technology to work with wind and solar. The reason they have incentives to do so outside the motion is threefold. Firstly, they recognize that oil reserves don't last forever, and in many cases, their access to these is already shrinking. Secondly, they're coming under increasing attack from customers, the middle class consumers that are already buying from them and are already saying that they have to transition into green tech. Thirdly, they care about their duty to their own shareholders, and shareholders obviously care about their long-term plans as well. And note, these are massive and profit-driven incentives that exist already. There's no need for OG to insert an additional incentive that only does this marginally. How does the motion affect their decision-making calculus? Firstly, the massive research arms that these oil and gas companies have are currently loss-making, but they are supplemented through profits from other sectors. When you slash those profits and make it so that they are barely able to keep afloat, they can no longer afford to run these massive loss-making research arms. But secondly, they are no longer able to buy up promising green tech startups and develop them further. This is important because if green tech has the high barriers to entry that OG says it does, then it is only after you are bought up that your technology can be properly developed and commercialized. And this means that many of the largest agents in the world that are investing into green tech are no longer able to do so. Could not be prouder of Sam.
I would like to thank Deputy Leader of OP for that fine speech and for what was a great top half this far. Reminder to finish your speeches by 7:15. And with that said, I would like to call upon a member of government to start a case for CG. Here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
3, 2, Two claims from closing government. First, will actually prove turning point about why the loss that you feel as a company is bigger than just loss of money, which is completely symmetric to taxes. I'm going to explain why the loss in terms of the ownership matters a lot. Secondly, I'm going to actually explain why green tech is able to succeed massively on our side by capturing specific market niches that are disabled if antitrust regulation is as strict against green startups as it is against polluting startups. I want to start with one point that takes OO out. So OO just think that antitrust means, ooh, take big baddies, break them up. The OG is completely not reliant on that. The OG's mechanism of like, you have less money can just be true if you have less growth. So I'm going to just explain why it is that it's likely that you don't break them up. The reason for this is because the governments don't want to, break up supply chains. That then means that they can't tax as many corporations anymore and have to employ much less people and less energy gets to people's homes. So governments don't have an incentive to do this in that way. They just want to prevent future expansion. But secondly, even if you have to break them up superficially, notice that there are many ways to still have different contractors that work together. So for example, you force a different board for each of the companies and they can't make money in the same joint way, but you still allow them to have the agreements between them about how they synergize the supply chain as long as they maintain, as long as they don't sustain in chat, as long as they don't sustain vertical monopolization. So there are ways to manage those economic requirements. First extension. Why do we think that there is a massive turning point in terms of additional mergers not big enough? The first thing I want to prove here is why taxes are insufficient, better than just saying that they're short term, which is what OG say, which is very strange because it's very assertive and never explain why they're more short term than anti-trust policy. So the reason that I think taxes are not a good idea, other than the fact that they don't serve as a sufficient incentive, which I'll explain in a second, is also because there's very little support for them. And the reason for this is because of two important differences between this and antitrust. First, taxes apply to any company in the market. You can't discriminate in taxes based on specific companies because taxes are made by the legislature and not antitrust authorities, and the legislator needs to make general laws that don't discriminate against a specific company. This means that you have the lobbying of all companies in the economy that use fossil fuels or a specific resource against you. You can't have it in a staggered way where you only do antitrust against a specific company, and then their lobbying can't overcome this. You have to do it against all at once. This means both the companies that are weaker than the market consolidating company and companies in other markets employ lobbying on their side, but not on ours. The second reason is that there's no second reason. That's enough. There's no support for taxes. Let's now talk about why the incentive is stronger when you have a market consolidating firm that you break up. So OG say just more expensive. As I mentioned, taxes are also more expensive. So what's the delta? Let's explain what the actual difference is. The first important difference is on growth potential. So if you as a company cannot say that you're going to grow by merging another smaller enterprise or by buying more real estate or train lines, that means that you can't promise future expansions and dividends to your investors. And that's much worse than having to pay a tax because one, often the taxes will only be 1%, whereas your expansion and growth will be a bigger share of the revenue that you're able to promise investors. But secondly, because you often have to pay taxes down the line after you've used pollution and after investors can cash out, which is why you can promise investor to reap the benefits of growth quickly and then cash out before you have to pay taxes, which is how you constantly get a stream of investors that's interested in your growth potential. So that's the first reason for why it's a much stronger incentive. The second reason is that now there is a lot of scare from the private market and from investors that invest in you about your stability. So remember that major gas company, just like any other major company, are often a valuable investment because of their stability in the stock price. So that's why pension funds will often invest in them as opposed to, for example, startup companies, because they seem much more certain, even if they generate a lower yield, because they're not in the stages of massive growth yet annually. The reason that that changes is that now antitrust regulation seems like a potential to shut you down. The antitrust mandate has said you can't expand anymore. So investors are scared that maybe they'll take more significant steps towards you that genuinely shut down the company and prevent them from consistent access to their dividends, which means you eliminate the comparative strength of stocks that these big energy company has compared to other startup companies, for example. This is why it's extremely scary for companies in a unique way over taxes. Before I get to my second extension on why we enabled the rise of green tech uniquely on our side, top half.
15 seconds. Utilities work in a vertical natural monopoly from generation to transmission to distribution. Given the info slide, it explicitly says limits on vertical integration.
Victor, baby, you're just saying natural as a way of explaining why you can't have different suppliers that collaborate between them. Let's talk about green tech and how it rises today. The first thing I want to establish here is that the problem with antitrust, when it doesn't differentiate between green and like emitting technologies, is that it has to punish companies that go into a specific niche. And that's because antitrust standards against fossil fuel companies were set in the past when using a specific resource was very inelastic compared to other resources. So I had to prevent companies from eclipsing the market of like gas or benzene and stuff like that, because there was no other gas that you could use. Certain cars only ran on benzene and stuff like that. This means that currently, without distinguishing between green and fossil fuel companies in antitrust regulation, there is a ban by antitrust and a strong disincentive to go into a specific niche and dominate it. This is bad because green tech companies are particularly valuable at being able to dominate a specific niche of resources, and that's their only way of being able to be economically prosperous. Why is that true? First, there is an incredible amount of economies of scale benefit for green technology that's even more true than fossil fuels. So, for example, production technology in order to build up solar panels and initial costs that go into setting up copper wires in the ground in the middle of the desert or into setting up the infrastructure necessary for a dam is very, very high. But once you have one dam, it's much easier to build the other because you have much more connecting infrastructure in the ground, because they're more technologically complex than all sorts of fossil fuel industries that are much easier to just build another mine. This is important because it means that if green tech can just dominate a specific niche by having dams across the river, which means they now control hydro, or by controlling and building up many, many labs that control the production of plant-based meats, it's much easier for them to start making a revenue out of this by consumers being able to get something that is increasingly less expensive to produce. Today, the antitrust authorities prevent them from doing that, and lawsuits can be waged against them when they control specific niches of the market because it seems identical to if a fossil fuel company were to control a specific gas or specific resource, which is why we think investors are much more wary today of investing in green tech companies that promise to invest in a specific niche. So we increase investor confidence of green tech startups. For those reasons, closing government.
I would like to thank member of government for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon member of opposition to start a case for CEO. Here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I love this motion, but in this round, I don't love the environment. One claim from closing opposition: this destroys manufacturing jobs, making global development more difficult, but also far better accessing the opening opposition impacts about political backlash. The premise of this argument is that such green antitrust policies, in practice, will disproportionately apply to manufacturing firms. And the structural reason for this is that manufacturing processes require machines that take large amounts of energy. Lots of CO2 is released when you're trying to create cement. It's used through coal, which furnaces rely on. It creates an unusual amount of waste in its waste products, which then emit CO2. And obviously, this is more carbon intensive than alternative industries such as service industries. We know this as an empirical fact. And the structural reason for this is that if you think of other industries that exist, like banking or hospitality, they use a lot less energy or have the capacity to invest in offsets to a greater extent. Step 2. Why do green antitrust policies therefore get applied against manufacturing firms? One, as proven, if they are unusually carbon intensive, then these policies are most likely to be applied upon them based on the way that these policies are written. But secondly, even if Gov creates some incentives for manufacturing firms to go green, as top half says, it is impossible to offset significant CO2 emissions that manufacturing firms emit. And there are a couple of structural reasons about why this is true. One, it takes a long time to develop strong clean energy systems and to transition supply chains away from fossil fuels. Your business model has been based on this for decades. So there's a time lag. Even if OO is right that some companies are trying to switch to green technology right now, they get slapped with the antitrust measures in the interim before they're able to actually offset the carbon intensive emissions that they're releasing. Secondly, DPM's own mechanism says companies want profit in the short term, and shareholder capitalism is becoming increasingly dominated by things like short-term day trading and increasingly short holding periods, and therefore you prioritize the short-term gains of relatively cheaper fossil fuels versus the long-term gains of investing in clean energy to a more significant extent, even if they create some marginal incentive there. Thirdly, it's hard to scale clean energy in your supply chain. So for example, you need tons of land to make solar effective so that you get a sufficient amount of sunlight during any time of day such that you can then supply that energy to people. I also want to explain beneath this why the application of these green antitrust policies is going to be applied fairly aggressively against such companies. And there are two observations I want to make. One, once you put these laws on the books, people in firms like the FTC want big wins because their careers and their reputations are on the line. That's why, for example, Lina Khan has gone after Google really heavily in the past few months. The easiest way to get those big wins is by going after manufacturing companies, since they, by definition, are the most carbon-intensive firms to a more significant extent. This is also why closing government's characterization is wrong. In many cases, it's not the fucking legislature that's imposing these policies. It's often independent firms like the FTC. Let's then engage with the two reasons that CG gives for their characterization. One, you won't break up these firms directly because it's politically unpopular, but my characterization beats this because the types of people who are leading these breakup missions are insulated from political criticism, i.e. you care more about what legal scholars think of you rather than what voters think of you, and therefore you prioritize your own wins over what voters think. The second thing they say, like this is a good one, is you still have contractors, so you can still coordinate between different companies. That's called collusion, which would obviously be subject to green antitrust measures. But secondly, for GovBench to get the extent of their impacts, they have to concede that these antitrust measures are applied reasonably aggressively such that these companies lose a substantial amount of money. And I want to be clear about this burden. You don't need to believe that these antitrust policies are applied aggressively to believe our extension, but it just magnifies our extension. Step 3. What happens when you apply these policies aggressively against manufacturing firms? There are two broad buckets of impacts. One, you create a substantial amount of job loss when manufacturing firms get broken up. Why do you get that job loss? One, as open and government concedes, these companies become less profitable. When they're less profitable, they cannot afford to hire many workers, and you're not going to take your money out of things like executives' bonuses to a more significant extent because executives want to make more money, so the easiest thing for you to do is just to lay off workers to a more significant extent. And secondly, these manufacturing job losses are going to be more significant than potential new jobs that could be created for two reasons. One, manufacturing jobs are less skill intensive than alternative jobs that could be created by alternative green technology firms. And the structural reason for this is that manufacturing firms require less expertise. You just need to assemble parts together. Whereas working at green technology firms on average requires a bit more scientific knowledge about energy grids and tends to rely a lot more on human capital than physical capital. The implicit response that could exist from opening government to this argument is like, fossil fuels are running out right now, so maybe manufacturing won't be efficient for long. But this is obviously untrue. You can find new natural resources through fracking to a more significant extent, especially because strategies like fracking are becoming relatively more politically unpopular. Also, current projections say that fossil fuels might run out by 2050, but our extension still applies in like the next 25 years. Before we move on, OG.
The lives of workers in manufacturing are awful because huge firms buy everyone else and the only employer. Antitrust creates competing firms who all still want to manufacture but have to pay their workers more because of competition.
Yeah, but they're less efficient. They can employ fewer people, as I already point out. Secondly, this is horrible for growth in emerging markets. I want to point out in terms of characterization that Top Half oddly assumes this debate only applies in Western liberal democracies, and the literal only likelihood they give for this is there's more regulatory infrastructure, but obviously not every non-WLD has terrible infrastructure. Think about countries like India and Brazil. Here's the key point. Many of these countries are trying to get out of agriculture-based economies. The way this happens is that as people exist in agriculture, farmers have more security to move into cities while their crops are off cycle and to take up manufacturing jobs. Their policy makes it harder because when you prevent things like mergers, you as an individual manufacturing company have a harder time branching out into different locations to make manufacturing relatively more accessible for different farmers. Why are agriculture-based economies terrible? One, people make even less money flipping the opening government POI. You rely on subsistence wages, especially given that crop cycles tend to be prone to volatility and natural disasters. And secondly, if you care about pollution, how fucking pollution intensive is agriculture? The tractors are powered by things like diesel and gasoline, which pollute way more. So the endpoint of this is clear. Tons of people lose their jobs and global development becomes harder. You don't need to believe both of our impacts to win. You just need to believe one. Let's weigh against opening opposition. One, OO's main contribution is that prices will be higher, but our harm is more intense intense and concentrated, i.e. people lose their whole jobs. And the reason an intense and concentrated impact matters more is because it's worse to be hit by a cannonball than have like 10,000 raindrops fall upon you. Their harm is relatively more dispersed because the higher prices spread out across many different consumers. Secondly, it's how we access their politics arguments on losing support for other green tech measures, because the biggest thing that people want is their jobs. So we amplify their impact by proving why people lose their whole livelihoods, which increases the political anger that opening opposition talks about, meaning we access their arguments about getting relatively more support for green tech measures, whilst Gov worsens it. Finally, it outweighs claims on environment because we are certain about the existence of people alive right now. We are uncertain about future generations.
I would like to thank member of OP for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Gov Whip to close up the Gov bench inside of this debate. Here.
Can you see me and hear me?
Yes to both.
Okay. First, I want to respond to closing opposition. First is that the manufacturing claim, the manufacturing factories and companies often have far easier way to be transitioning to green, because you don't have to be changing the entirety of your business model. You just need to be implementing slightly less carbon intensive stuff. This is even a worse impact than opening opposition, who at least was smart enough to identify things that would be actually difficult to transition. Number two, this is affecting companies that are already very, very large, right? Because that's where they're actually being affected by those thresholds and the limits on vertical integration. So it's unlikely that they're going to go out of business and withdraw from countries entirely, so everyone needs to be working in agriculture. Instead, it's rather that they're going to be incentivized to transition to green and just do all of those things without all the horrible, harmful externalities. Or we are obviously moving investment towards greener companies, which can hire more people. They have response to it, which is, oh, but now you have to be like more qualified to do those jobs. I think they are mistaking what the difference between a carbon intensive company and a not carbon intensive company is. The difference is not like now you have to do tech in a tech firm versus low skill manufacturing. The difference is that you're still doing low skill manufacturing just in a factory that has better better processes that are not carbon intensive. So you still do low manufacturing labor. It's just in a company that's not polluting rivers and polluting the air, right? So that skill stuff literally didn't work. The final thing is just like, I do think that the long-term effects obviously matter, because like their weighing is nonsensical. First of all, we do know that future generations will exist and there will be comparatively far more people that will be struggling with jobs. But I would also know that like this is not just about future generations. Like the impacts of the environment are already affecting people who are living now, especially in many of the countries that they care about, where you already can see issues like rising sea levels, like people's entire livelihoods being damaged by droughts and similar things. So all of that obviously means that it's preferable to trade off perhaps slightly slower expansion of jobs and transitioning towards greener companies for continuing a process that is going to harm people, not just in the future and future generations, but already now. The final thing to respond to closing opposition is about why this is not going to be done in an absolutely insane way. Because their claim, those civil servants, they want really big wins. First of all, the politically appointed civil servants also don't want to do something that would be incredibly economically disastrous, because I would suggest that the legal scholars also wouldn't praise them for that if they do something that is unnecessary, that obviously has far more harms than benefits. This is nonsense. You will obviously do it well. Let's talk about opening opposition. So with respect to opening opposition, the CA team isn't stupid, right? Opening opposition didn't read the motion properly, because we are not breaking up the carbon-intensive companies into lots of tiny, smaller ones, which would maybe cause some degree of blackouts, but we are heavily decreasing their growth potential. That's what the info slide says, right? Like lower thresholds, limits on vertical integration. So these companies can't grow any longer, but it doesn't mean that you're breaking them up in a way that they literally can't stop, have to stop providing things. But the other thing is that I'm not sure why them growing more would actually make anything cheaper necessarily, because the fact that they are monopolized means that they often do not have the incentive to be actually making their services cheaper. The second thing to say is that obviously we are making green more competitive, which also generates things like energy, right? Like supporting solar, supporting wind, supporting hydropower, or even supporting nuclear where it's not carbon intensive nearly as much. All of those, opening opposition didn't explain why those are not accessible and why within this process we are not able to do this replacement and provide energy to people on the same level. So it replaces a lot of the existing supply. It's just obviously much more sustainable, and that is more important. The second thing on opening opposition is that OG correctly points out they are also trying to harm the carbon-intensive companies just in a really stupid way. And I know that we're taught to say it's not contradiction, it's nuance, but this just is a contradiction, right? Like if they are trying to tax those companies, then they would be also reducing their profits. But crucially, these companies will not change because of the tax, because they can still get investment, unlike on our side, they can still grow that overcomes the tax. So the tax and the tax also doesn't benefit the green companies in the same way. So taxes would also maybe make them increase their prices, but without encouraging the movement of investment towards green, so they will be getting their harms, but none of our benefits. Amitai also explains why taxes are not an option, which is a crucial way of engaging with opening opposition in a way that opening government did not do, which is by one, explaining why are far less likely to be implemented because of all the carbon-intensive companies lobbying against it collectively, as opposed to now you're also getting the smaller companies not affected by antitrust on board to support the antitrust, but also because in terms of achieving the results. The final thing I want to address on OO is why the lack of incentives why the incentives don't exist regardless. Status quo, market growth is far more possible when you are carbon intensive because you get cheaper costs by dumping stuff, by having lower standards. And sure, maybe they're correct that somehow long-term, there will be an advantage to be green. But the problem is your current shareholders are demanding growth now and value appreciation now. So you do not transition to green. On our side, we're changing it because the only way that your shareholders can get value appreciation and expansion is if you do transition green, which is when you actually get that force towards it. What do we explain else in the extension? We explain why this is actually the tipping point. But before I talk about it, opening up.
Our argument is about making it increasingly more difficult to vertically integrate utilities. It can be done through breaking it up or just having higher market thresholds. How do you prevent the rolling blackouts and the rising energy prices?
First of all, right, like the energy is already available and we are preventing it by replacing it with green energy. Why is this the tipping point? Opening government outlines the problem really well. They say carbon intensive is big and green is small, but it's unclear why they are changing it because the carbon intensive are still big, they just can't get even bigger, and the green are still smaller. So it's unclear why this gets, they explain why it's cheaper relatively, but not why it actually moves anything, right? So, and closing opposition asks them, and they don't really have a response because they say, well, they are scared of the PR of trials. I'm not sure why they care. And the rest of their mechanisms is dependent on the costs actually changing. We explain why there's a tipping point because it changes investment flows that are not dependent on size, but on growth potential. If I want to buy stock, I want it to appreciate in value. But now carbon-intensive companies can't appreciate in value because they can't expand. Comparatively, green energy has lots of growth potential, and meaning that investors either flock there or are forcing the carbon-intensive companies to become green in order to be able to achieve that potential. We're proving the tipping point. We're dealing with off-bench. I'm proud to propose.
I would like to thank GovWeb for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon OpWeb to sum up this debate. Here.
Cool. Can everyone hear and see me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'll take POI from opening government. So just put it in the chat. The way I want to start with is to ask the simple question of whether or not on your flows you see reasons for why the environment matters far more than economic growth for people right now in the vast majority of the developing world. And the answer to that question is no, you do not, because no other team in this debate actually explains why environment is substantially more important. And the reason why that is particularly salient is because that is why maths extension gets ahead. There are two ways in which you can weigh maths extension. The first way you weigh this extension is on the basis of certainty, which is even if you buy everything that opening government and closing government says, it is uncertain whether or not the environment substantially becomes better over time. Because if you listen to everyone's analysis, there's credible reason to believe why we might be already past the point of no return. It is unclear whether or not things, for example, like research and innovation in the environment will trickle down towards every single individual, and whether or not that meaningfully means, for example, certain villages are not going to get overflooded and resources will be distributed equally. So it's uncertain whether or not GovBench do get to their end outcome, but it is certain, as Matt explains, that there's millions of individuals in the global south that lose their ability to access their jobs when manufacturing companies are forced to be broken up or just don't have the ability to adapt as a result of this policy. And that is when there's a credible harm that necessarily triggers. But second of all, it is also weighed on the basis of intensity, because we explain why there's massive intensity that happens right now, which is you literally cannot feed your family anymore. You literally do not have any ability to do anything else, and that ought be prioritized over any speculative and uncertain potential harms that might exist in the future. There are therefore three things I want to talk about in this debate. The first is on the consideration of manufacturing and why we get ahead here. I want to first analyze what government whip actually says in response, because their response was just like, well, no, you can obviously do things strategically and cleverly in a way that allows for manufacturing to coexist. Like, what? Like what are these things? Because like government just kind of says this and then doesn't explain it. We explain a member of opposition why like the structural nature of manufacturing makes it impossible, because if the machinery runs on fucking things that causes smoke and all these sorts of things, like you can't replace that. That is just how the fucking industry works. And if that is the case, then it probably is very difficult for you to replace those things. That is why one of two things happen. Either it is the case that these companies just get unfairly and massively penalized by this policy, therefore there's massive economic downturn and harm, or, and this is the nuance that Matt explains, they attempt to change. But the issue is it is immensely difficult to transition to green energy when your starting point is manufacturing, which means it is almost impossible for you to offset enough of CO2 for you to meaningfully fall under this policy. And as a result of that, this explains why you're massively going to be harmed as a result of that. And I want to point out, they actually ignore a variety of different reasons that we explain for why manufacturing companies just, cannot transition quickly, right? For instance, GovWhip drops our analysis on why clean energy is very hard to scale, why, for example, it is very hard to incorporate into your supply chain because you need lots of land, etc. All of the responses are just like, oh, well, alternative jobs are still low skilled. But obviously, these particular responses are contingent on manufacturing firms being able to use enough green energy to offset their CO2 emissions, which, to be clear, I do not think they do, which is why our analysis at this particular point in time still gets ahead. How do you weigh up this particular argument, and why is this argument independently winning? The first reason why is because these are the most vulnerable individuals. Think about the people who work in manufacturing in the global south. These are often people who do not have a lot of transferable skills. So the moment in which they're laid off is the same moment in which they're screwed, in which they literally have no mechanism of ascertaining subsistence, and as a result of that, there's just a massive certain harm that exists. But second of all, and importantly here, what is the alternative then for these countries? Because what we explain in the second extension, to no response, by the way, from closing government, is that it is just immensely difficult for these countries to grow as a result of that, which means these countries then do not have mechanisms of development, which is not only harmful for the reason Matt already explains, but also this is a far better mechanism that mechanizes the top half debate on buying into environmentalism. Because if you have massive amounts of the population that feel as though you're screwed over as a result of this particular policy, CF the nuance we give you on manufacturing, that is the same moment in which they're far less likely going to buy into your policies. That is the same moment in which you do not solve these particular structural issues. And as a result of that, this mechanism does a far better job of mechanizing opening opposition as well, to explain why there's far less buying into green technology. The reason why opening opposition falls short here is because if you listen to the government's responses towards opening opposition, they're quite credible, right? Like, why isn't it the case that firms are going to adapt in strategic ways? We explain why it is almost impossible for these firms to adapt, and that is why this analysis ought to be valued above opening opposition. The second contention in this debate I want to talk about is the growth for the developing world. And I think the thing I want to point out about how you weigh this argument in the debate is that this is logically prior to the gov bench, because what we explain under this particular analysis is it is immensely difficult for a whole host of different countries to adapt, not just the Western liberal democracies that top half chooses to talk about. So for instance, if you're Brazil or you're India and you're stuck in agriculture, it is very difficult for you to make the massive jump under this policy to meaningfully adapt to this policy, and therefore you're just going to be massively economic penalized as a result of that. What then was the harm to this? First of all, it just means that growth in these particular countries is very difficult. But second, and more importantly, it means that it is very, very difficult, therefore, for you to meaningfully get economic development, which is oftentimes in terms of weighing the prerequisite to doing a lot of the stuff that top half wants to. Because for an average person, the reason why they end up caring about, for example, environmental policy is because they have the economic subsistence and the ability to do so. And therefore, this analysis explains on scale why millions of individuals in the global south are far less receptive to buy into these particular sorts of policies, which on numeracy weighs above top half, because we explain why more stakeholders are likely going to be opposed to it. But second of all, just also has an independent impact on certainty of people losing their jobs. That is why this gets ahead. The final thing I want to talk about is why governments don't actually get the change that they want to talk about. Before that, opening government.
In developing countries, not everyone works in manufacturing, but everyone is affected by oil spills, and growth potential is harmed by big companies who extract resources and leave. The weighing has been there since OG.
No. So what we explain is the vast majority of individuals in the global south do work in manufacturing. But second of all, like, I'm just not really sure why oil spills is particularly the tipping point in this debate. Surely, as opening opposition correctly identifies, like, you can have other regulations. Also, oil spills are super dispersed. Like, I just don't really think this is the point you are winning on. But even if you don't buy that, I'm going to weigh our certain harms against your speculative benefits at the last thing in my speech. So the problem with GovBench at the end of the day is they do not actually explain why you meaningfully get the change that you get as a result of this particular policy. There are two particular shortfallings of the GovBench. The first is the skill of their change does not actually track, because it isn't the case as opening government claims that, like, the benefit of, like, working in carbon-intensive industries is 50% plus, and then this policy makes it minus 50%. Like, that's not how math works. And the issue is, for all the reasons they explain, things like the economies of scale still existing, even if it's lesser, things like the sunk cost of infrastructure, things, for example, like these certain perceived gains where that doesn't exist for green technology, for example, there's still a lot of individuals for these particular individual investors to not necessarily shift towards green technology. All they say in response to this, and this is the second response, is, well, but like the issue is with stability. But the problem is, for all of opening government's analysis, stability is far worse, not only on face in green technology industries, but as a result of this policy per our extension, because we explain why it's likely the case that there's far more instability that happens as a result of this, and therefore there's far less investment into different types of sectors. This is why OG and CG do not get the efficacy they want to go for, and our arguments went out. For all those reasons, opposed.
I would like to thank Opposition Whip for that fine speech and all four teams for a lovely debate. Now, please leave. You will hear the results soonish in the main hall.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, let's take 2 minutes for initial. In the meantime, Clement, can you stop the recording?